Story 1, A Translator's Unusual Assignment Expanded. I never imagined that being a translator would lead me to such a strange and unforgettable experience. My job had taken me to many places and situations, but when I received a call from a morgue, I couldn't help but feel a mix of curiosity and dread. The man on the phone introduced himself as David, a mortician, and explained that he needed my help. At first, I assumed it would be a straightforward translation task for a grieving family. Instead, his request left me completely speechless. David's first question wasn't something I expected. "Have you ever seen a dead body before?" Caught off guard, I replied cautiously, "Yes, I've seen a few during my time working at a hospital." David sounded relieved. "Good," he said. "That'll make this a bit easier to explain." He went on to describe his predicament. A Southeast Asian woman in her 80s had passed away, and her body was brought to him by her family. Her passing wasn't unusual. She had a history of health complications, including several strokes that had left her bedridden for years. The problem, as David explained, was her body's position. She had passed away, curled into a tight fetal position, and rigor mortis had set in. "I've been a mortician for over 20 years, David said, "and I've dealt with bodies in all kinds of conditions. Usually I can gently work through the stiffness to position them for preparation, but in this case, it's different. She was frail in life, and her bones are so brittle that I'm afraid any attempt to straighten her limbs could cause them to break." He paused, then added, "The family has requested that she be dressed in her traditional funeral attire, which requires her to be fully straightened out. I can't risk damaging her, but I think there's another way, something I've done before, but it's a bit unconventional." At this point, I was intrigued but also wary. "What do you need from me?" I asked. David hesitated, then said, "I'd like you to translate instructions directly to the deceased in her native language." I blinked in confusion. "You mean, talk to her?" "Exactly," David replied. "In my experience, treating the deceased with respect, as if they can still hear, can sometimes make the process easier. I can't speak her language, but you can. I'd like you to help me communicate with her." Every logical part of my brain screamed that this was absurd, but I couldn't deny the sincerity in David's voice. After a moment's hesitation, I agreed. David set up a FaceTime call, and when the screen connected, I saw him standing in a sterile room with bright overhead lights. The body was out of view, but David explained the situation in more detail as he adjusted the camera. "She passed away curled up," he said, "and her limbs are completely stiff. The family is devastated and has specifically requested that she be dressed in a formal hanbok for the funeral. I don't want to disappoint them, but I also don't want to risk damaging her fragile frame." He moved aside, and for the first time I saw her. The elderly woman's body lay curled tightly on the preparation table, her knees drawn up to her chest and her arms crossed protectively over her torso. Even through the screen, I could see how frail she was. David picked up her right arm and tried to gently extend it, but the limb didn't budge. "See what I mean?" he said. Taking a deep breath, I spoke in her native language. "Grandmother, the man here is trying to help you. Please, can you straighten your arm for him?" What happened next sent chills down my spine. David tried again, and this time her arm moved with surprising ease. He looked up at the camera, his expression a mix of relief and amazement. "It worked," he said, shaking his head. "Let's keep going." We repeated the process for each limb, with me addressing her respectfully and David following my translations. Slowly but surely, her body relaxed into a more natural position. Once she was fully extended, David began dressing her in the traditional attire. Throughout the process, I couldn't shake the surreal feeling of speaking to someone who was no longer alive, and yet, it felt like she was listening. When the task was complete, David thanked me profusely. "I know this might seem strange to you," he said, "but I've learned over the years that treating the deceased with dignity can make all the difference. Whether it's psychological or spiritual, I can't say for sure. But I've seen this kind of respect ease even the most difficult cases." As the call ended, I sat back in my chair, replaying the events in my mind. It was, without a doubt, the strangest assignment I'd ever taken, but it was also one I'd never forget. Story 2, Eyes That Wouldn't Close. As a mortician, you'd think I'd seen and experienced everything by now, but every so often, something happens that leaves even me unsettled. This story was one of those times. It all began with the body of a middle-aged woman who had passed away from ovarian cancer. She was only 52, a small and petite woman, barely over 4', which made preparing her body a relatively straightforward task, or so I thought. The family had requested that she be dressed in traditional cultural attire for her funeral, and I took every care to ensure she looked as peaceful and dignified as possible. I carefully cleaned her, arranged her hair, and dressed her in the elegant garments they had provided. Everything seemed to be going smoothly, but then I noticed something peculiar. Her eyes. No matter what I did, her eyelids refused to stay closed. Now, this isn't an uncommon problem in my line of work. The muscles around the eyes can sometimes be uncooperative after death. That's why we use a special tool called eye caps, small plastic discs designed to sit beneath the eyelids and keep them shut. I had already placed a set of eye caps under her lids, but for some reason they weren't working. Her eyes kept drifting open, revealing the unsettling white sclera beneath. I tried replacing the caps with a fresh set, thinking the first might have been defective. Still, her eyes refused to stay closed. It was late already, past 10 p.m., and I was preparing her for a funeral scheduled early the next morning. Exhausted and running out of options, I decided to try something unconventional. I grabbed my keys and headed to a nearby gas station, where I bought a tube of superglue. Yes, you read that right, superglue. It's not a tool morticians use often, but in rare cases like this, it can be a lifesaver. When I returned to the mortuary, I carefully applied a small amount of glue to her eyelids and held them shut until it dried. Finally, her eyes stayed closed. Looking at her now, lying peacefully in her casket, she seemed at rest, almost as if she were simply asleep. I let out a sigh of relief, confident that her family would be pleased with how she looked. The next morning, just before the funeral, I performed one final check to ensure everything was in order. Her eyes were still shut, and everything appeared perfect. I closed the casket and arranged for it to be delivered to the funeral site, feeling satisfied that my work was done. But when we arrived at the site and opened the casket for the family's final viewing, I was met with gasps of shock. Her eyes were wide open again. Not only were they open, but the white caps beneath her eyelids were fully visible, and the dried remnants of glue were smeared on her lashes and even on 2 of her fingers. It was a horrifying sight. I felt my stomach drop as the family looked to me for an explanation. I'm so sorry, I stammered. I had trouble keeping her eyes closed, but if you'll give me a moment, I'll fix this. I quickly put on gloves and set to work, carefully removing the eye caps and scraping away the dried glue as best I could. Her husband, a quiet man who had been standing silently beside the casket, finally spoke up. "It's all right," he said, his voice calm. "You've done your best. There's no need to try again." Instead, he turned to one of the other mourners, a young man in his mid-20s, and motioned for him to come forward. I later learned this was her son, Lee. As Lee approached the casket, I noticed the hesitation in his movements. He seemed nervous, almost afraid. The family spoke to him in their native language, urging him to do something, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. Then, I heard his older sister whisper to him in English, "What are you so afraid of? She's your mother." Lee stood over the casket, staring down at his mother's face. Finally, he reached out, placing a trembling hand over her eyes. He leaned in and spoke softly to her in their language, his words barely audible. What happened next sent chills down my spine. Her eyelids slowly closed. No glue, no eye caps, just a gentle touch from her son, and her eyes stayed shut. I was stunned. After all the trouble I'd gone through, it seemed like Lee had done the impossible with nothing more than a few whispered words. When he stepped back, I couldn't help but approach him. "I have to ask," I said, keeping my voice low. "What did you say to her? How did you do that?" Lee hesitated, glancing around as if unsure whether to answer. Then he sighed and explained. 4 years ago, I married a woman from a different culture. My mother didn't approve. She always told me it wouldn't work, and that if my wife didn't leave me within 2 years, she wouldn't close her eyes in death. It was her way of saying she'd die unhappy, holding on to that grudge. He paused, his expression softening. I told her she was wrong, that my wife loves me, and that she had nothing to worry about. I reassured her that everything was okay. I think that's all she needed to hear. I didn't know what to say. Whether it was superstition, a mother's love, or something beyond explanation, I couldn't deny what I had just witnessed. The rest of the funeral went smoothly, but I'll never forget the look of peace on her face and the quiet strength in Lee's voice as he gave his mother the closure she needed to finally rest. The rest of the night after finding the soldier's letter was anything but peaceful. My curiosity about the letter had unearthed not just a story, but an emotional weight that hung in the room like a storm cloud. I stayed in my office for a while, trying to shake off the unsettling feelings, but something wouldn't let me rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt as if I were being watched, like someone was standing just over my shoulder. I decided to go back to the preparation room to finish tidying up before morning. As I entered, the temperature seemed to drop noticeably. I could feel goosebumps rise on my skin, though the thermostat hadn't changed. I glanced at the soldier's body, lying still on the table. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first, but then I noticed the corner of the letter sticking out from the pocket where I'd tucked it back. I swear I'd folded the letter and placed it entirely back in his pocket. It was such a small thing, but in that moment it felt like a glaring sign. Hesitant, I approached the table and carefully tucked the letter back in fully, whispering, "It's safe. Your family will have it soon." Just as I turned to leave, I heard a faint noise like boots scuffing against a floor. My breath caught. Looking back, I saw nothing. I told myself it was just my nerves getting the better of me. I left the room and decided to try to sleep in my office for a few hours before the soldier's family arrived. The morning after. When the family came in, they were quiet and somber, as you'd expect. The soldier's parents were elderly, their shoulders hunched under the weight of their loss. His sister, though clearly devastated, carried a resolute expression, as if she was determined to handle everything for her grieving parents. As gently as I could, I explained about the military hat and apologized for not having it. To my relief, they had brought it with them, along with other personal items they wanted placed in the casket. While the family was there, I asked if they wanted me to include the letter. The soldier's sister looked at me sharply. "What letter?" I hesitated. It hadn't been mentioned in their instructions. "There was a letter in his back pocket," I said carefully. "I assumed it was for you." The mother began to cry softly, and the father exchanged a knowing glance with his daughter. The sister spoke up, her voice firm despite the emotion behind it. "Please, let me see it." I retrieved the letter from his pocket and handed it to her. She unfolded it carefully and began to read. I watched her expression shift from confusion to sadness, then to something harder to define. When she was done, she folded the letter back and tucked it into her purse. "Thank you," she said simply, her tone now colder. A haunting revelation. After the funeral, I couldn't stop thinking about the family's reaction. Something about it didn't sit right with me. A few weeks later, I received a follow-up call from the soldier's sister. She said she wanted to thank me personally for the care I had shown her brother and for ensuring the letter made its way to them. I hesitated, unsure if I should ask the question burning in my mind, but curiosity got the better of me. "Can I ask what was in the letter?" I don't mean to pry, but it seemed significant. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, tinged with a mix of sadness and regret. "It wasn't what we expected," she admitted. "We thought it might be a goodbye note, something personal for the family, but instead it was, well, it was almost like a confession. He talked about things he saw during his deployment, things he couldn't reconcile with. It wasn't just about the screams he heard at night. It was about orders he was forced to follow, choices he couldn't unmake. He felt haunted, not just by what he witnessed, but by what he'd done." She stopped for a moment, then added, "He begged for forgiveness not just from us, but from the universe, from whoever might be listening." I didn't know what to say. My mind flashed back to the night I'd worked on his body, to the overwhelming sense of presence in the room, to his voice demanding I take the hairnet off. "It wasn't just a letter to us," she continued. "It was a plea for peace. A final goodbye." That conversation stayed with me for weeks, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the soldier's soul was still searching for something. Then, one night, I had a dream. In it, I was back in the preparation room, standing over his body. This time, he wasn't angry or shouting. He was standing beside me in his full uniform, including the hat that had arrived too late. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice calm and steady. I wanted to ask him if he'd found peace, but before I could, he saluted me and disappeared. When I woke up, I felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. Since that dream, I haven't felt his presence again. I can only hope it means he's finally at rest.